The rain did not just fall that night in London. It hammered against the cobblestones like a rhythmic warning, a relentless drumbeat for a funeral that had not yet happened. I stood by the window of the Vance estate, watching the carriage lanterns flicker in the distance. My name is Julian, a silent witness to the tragedy unfolding in the drawing room behind me. My sister, Clara, was standing by the fireplace, her silhouette stiff and unyielding against the dying embers. She was 22, vibrant, and possessed a spirit that even our father's failures couldn't quite extinguish. But tonight, that spirit was being bartered. Our father, a man who had gambled away our heritage, our land, and even the silver on our table, sat with his head in his hands. Opposite him sat the solicitor of the Marquess of Blackwood. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the bitter reality of debt that could never be repaid in gold. £20,000, a king's ransom, or, as it turned out, the price of a woman's life. The deal was simple, cold, and final. Clara would marry the Marquess, and the debt would vanish as if it had never existed. She was being given to a man she had never met, a man the tongue whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. They called him the drunken Duke's shadow, the Marquess of Blackwood, a recluse who had turned his back on the world after a scandal that left his reputation in tatters and his soul soaked in whiskey. When the carriage arrived to take her away 3 days later, the sky was the color of a bruised lung. I watched Clara climb into that dark, velvet-lined box. She didn't cry. She didn't look back at the father who had sold her. She kept her chin high, her hazel eyes fixed on the horizon as if she were marching toward a battlefield rather than a marriage bed. The journey to Blackwood Manor took hours, moving away from the warmth of the city and into the wild, jagged edges of the northern coast. The trees there grew twisted, leaning away from the sea winds, and the mist clung to ground like a shroud. As the manor finally appeared to the fog, even the horses seemed to hesitate. It was a fortress of dark stone and ivy that looked more like claws than plants. Most of the windows were shuttered, and the gardens were a graveyard of gray roses and overgrown thorns. It was a house of mourning, a place where time had stopped. The doors opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the earth. We were met by an elderly butler, a man named Holloway, whose eyes held a flicker of pity that made my blood run cold. And then there he was, Arthur, the Marquess of Blackwood. He didn't greet us in the foyer. He was slumped in a high-backed chair in the library, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he no longer valued. The room smelled of peat smoke and stale spirits. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 30, with features that might have been handsome if they weren't hollowed out by grief and excess. His dark hair was unkempt, his jaw covered in a rough stubble, and his cravat hung loose around a neck that looked like it had forgotten to feel of fine silk. He held a glass of amber liquid with a hand that didn't tremble, but moved with a terrifying, slow deliberation. He looked at Clara not as a bride, but as a ghost. His blue eyes were bloodshot, piercing through the gloom with a cynical sharpness that felt like a physical blow. "So," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used for anything but cursing in a long time. "The Vance girl, my expensive little prize." He didn't stand up. He didn't offer a hand. He simply gestured with his glass toward the shadows of the house. "Welcome to the tomb, my lady. I hope you brought your own light, for there is none left here." Clara took a step forward, her boots clicking sharply on the hardwood. She didn't flinch at his tone. She looked at the empty bottles on the floor, then back at the man who was now her husband by law. "I did not come here to find light, my lord," she replied, her voice ringing out with clarity that seemed to startle the very dust motes in the air. "I came here to live, and if this is a tomb, then I suggest you start digging, for I have no intention of lying down just yet." Arthur paused, the glass halfway to his lips. A muscle jumped in his jaw. For a fleeting second, the fog in his eyes cleared, replaced by a flicker of something raw, half amusement, half fury. He took a long, Slow drink, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a tension that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. This was the beginning of their sentence. A woman sold to a man who wanted only to vanish, and a man who had forgotten that even in the deepest darkness, the heart still beats. They were two strangers bound by a contract of shame, standing in a house that feasted on secrets. Neither of them knew then that the debt paid in flesh would eventually be redeemed in fire. The first night at Blackwood Manor did not bring rest, but rather the weight of a silence that seemed to have teeth. After that freezing reception in the library, Arthur simply signaled for Holloway to take her away, as if Clara's presence were a burden too heavy for his alcohol-soaked eyes to bear. I watched her climb the marble staircase, the candle shadows dancing on the walls like mocking specters. Her quarters were vast, but they smelled of disuse and long-forgotten dried flowers. There was no warmth in the fireplaces, no welcome in the cold silk sheets. Clara spent the early hours of the morning wide awake, sitting by the window, watching the turbulent sea crashing against the cliffs below the estate. She was not a woman of easy tears, but the isolation of that place was a physical force, a constant pressure against her chest. By dawn, however, melancholy gave way to determination. If she was condemned to live in this mausoleum, she would not do it amidst filth and despair. At daybreak, she did not wait to be served. She descended the stairs with the firm step of a general, finding a house plunged into a deep lethargy. The few remaining servants wandered like ghosts, directionless, reflecting the state of their master. She found Arthur in the dining hall at noon. He was worse than the night before. The sunlight streaming through the cracks in the heavy curtains seemed to wound his eyes, and he already had a bottle of wine open before him. He hadn't bothered to dress properly. He wore a dark silk robe over an unbuttoned shirt, and the scent of spirits emanated from him like a toxic aura. "You are persistent," he muttered, without looking at her, his long, pale fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop. Most women would have locked themselves in their rooms or been begging to return to London by this hour. Clara did not answer immediately. She walked to the nearest window and, with a sudden movement, threw open the velvet curtains. Daylight flooded the room, revealing decades of dust and neglect. Arthur let out a snarl of pain and covered his eyes with his arm. "Close that. Damn it, woman, do you want to blind me?" "I want you to see," Clara retorted, approaching the table with a courage that left him momentarily speechless. "See what is left of you in this house. You hide in the dark because you are afraid that the light will show how little remains of the man people used to respect." He stood up abruptly, the chair dragging with a piercing screech on the floor. He was much taller than her, and his anger, though drunken, was intimidating. He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. "You know nothing about what I've lost," he hissed, his voice vibrating with a raw pain she hadn't expected to find. "You were sold by your father to pay gambling debts. You are just another item on this list of possessions. Do not try to act as if you are my savior. I did not ask for you, and I certainly do not need your pity." The air between them grew thick, a static electricity that made the hair on Clara's arm stand up. For the first time, she didn't just see the drunkard. She saw the fire that still burned beneath the ashes. There was a latent desire in that fury, a hunger for life that he desperately tried to suffocate with alcohol. Clara did not back down. On the contrary, she took a step forward, invading his personal space. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the erratic rhythm of his breath. "I don't pity you, Arthur," she whispered, her voice like silk over steel. "I have contempt for the waste you are making of yourself. If you want to die, do it at once. But as long as I am here, I will not allow you to drag this name and this house into the mud with me inside it." She reached out and, in a swift motion, grabbed a bottle of wine. Before he could react, she walked to the fireplace and poured the crimson contents over the cold ashes. The sound of the liquid hitting the metal echoed like a verdict. Arthur stood still, fists clenched at his sides, blue eyes flashing with a mixture of hatred and something he hadn't felt in years. Shock. No one had ever confronted him like that. No one had ever dared to touch his only solace. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice now low and dangerous, a warning that would have made anyone else tremble. But Clara only smiled, a sad and defiant smile. "It was a first step toward your healing, my lord. Dinner will be served at 8, and I expect you to be dressed like the Marquess you claim to be." She left the room without looking back, leaving him alone with the smell of spilled wine and the disturbing silence of his own mind. That afternoon, the direct confrontation had left a mark. The tension between them was no longer just repulsion. There was a dark curiosity, a challenge that began to awaken senses both believed to be dead. The days that followed our first confrontation were marked by a cold war fought in the shadowed corridors of Blackwood Manor. Arthur, the Marquess, tried to maintain his resistance, locking himself in his chambers and demanding that alcohol be delivered to him. But he underestimated the strength of the woman who now bore the title of Marchioness. Clara not only forbade the entry of new bottles into property, but she also began to dismantle the routine of decadence he had built. As the narrator of this story, I saw my lord's face change. The puffiness of drink began to recede, revealing the hard, aristocratic lines of his face, though his eyes still carried the weight of a world he wished to forget. The tension between the two reached a new level during a misty afternoon. Arthur, deprived of his usual solace, emerged from his study in a state of feverish irritation. He found Clara in the winter garden, where she was trying to revive some plants that were suffocating under neglect. The air there was humid and warm, heavy with the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. When he entered, the impact of his presence was almost physical. He was sober, a forced and painful sobriety, and for the first time he seemed to notice every detail of his wife. The curve of her neck as she leaned over the flowers, the way her green silk dress hugged her form, and the determination in her eyes. "You think you've won," he said, his voice deeper now that it wasn't dulled by wine. He walked toward her, each step exuding a latent threat that made Clara's heart hammer against her ribs. He stopped so close she could feel the heat of his skin, a radiation that seemed to consume the little space left between them. "You think that by taking the bottle out of my hand, you possess me, but you have no idea what lives inside me when I am not numb." Clara dropped the pruning shears and turned, refusing to back down before his imposing stature. Her breath was short, and desire, a feeling she had been trying to ignore, bloomed intensely in her womb. "I don't want to possess you, Arthur. I want you to possess yourself again," she replied, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. He reached out, and for a second she thought he would grab her by the shoulders in anger, but his fingers stopped millimeters from her face. The tremor in his hand was no longer from withdrawal, but from a violent restraint of desire. "You are a dangerous temptation, Clara," he murmured, and the glint in his blue eyes was no longer contempt, but a primal hunger. "I spent years trying to feel nothing, and now you come here and force me to feel everything. The anger, the shame, and the way I want you." The silence that followed was electric. The desire between them was almost palpable, a rope stretched to the limit, ready to snap. Arthur slid his hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her gently closer until their lips were a breath away. The sexual tension was so dense that the air seemed hard to breathe. "Then feel," she challenged in a whisper, closing her eyes as she felt his breath, now clean, smelling of mint and the cold of the outdoors, against her skin. "Don't hide anymore." In that moment, the Marquess of Blackwood was no longer a broken man, but a predator who had just found his reason for being. He didn't kiss her yet, but the way his thumb traced the outline of her lower lip was a promise that the restraint was coming to an end. Healing would not come only through renouncing the drink, but through the overwhelming passion that began to consume both of their shadows. The barrier Arthur had built around himself did not fall with a bang, but melted under the heat of a proximity that neither could avoid any longer. That night, Blackwood Manor felt different. The wind howled outside, but inside the library, the fire in the fireplace roared with renewed strength, casting long, golden shadows over the oak bookshelves. Arthur was sitting before the flames, but there were no bottles around him. Instead, he held a small silver locket, his eyes fixed on the metal with melancholic intensity. When Clara entered, she said nothing. She sat on the rug at his feet, her presence offering a silent comfort he finally seemed ready to accept. Her name was Margaret, he said suddenly, his voice low and husky, laden with vulnerability that made me, as the narrator, feel the weight of his grief. My first wife. I believed the world was made of light when I was with her, but I was arrogant. I was so focused on expanding my empire, on contracts and power, that I didn't notice when the light began to fade. She died alone, in an accident I could have prevented if I had been there, if I were the man she believed me to be. Clara reached out and placed her hand over his, covering the locket. You cannot punish the man you are today for the mistakes of the man you were yesterday, Arthur. He looked at her, and the pain in his blue eyes was replaced by something much more dangerous, an absolute need. He pulled her up, making her stand between his legs, his hands gripping her waist with an urgency that made Clara's blood boil. And who am I today, Clara? Thanks to you, I am no longer a ghost. But what you have awakened is a hunger that cannot be satisfied with words. The sexual tension that had been building for weeks finally burst. There was no more hesitation. Arthur buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of jasmine and warm skin, while his lips traced a trail of fire to the curve of her shoulder. Clara arched her back, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The desire between them was a storm, a force of nature that ignored titles, debts, and the past. "Tell me you want me," he demanded against her skin, his voice vibrating with a command that was also a plea. "Tell me this isn't just part of the contract." Clara stared at him, her hazel eyes shining with a wild passion. "I was never your property, Arthur, but I choose to be your woman." The kiss that followed was desperate, a collision of souls seeking redemption and pleasure. He lifted her, sitting her on the oak table, scattering papers and bills across the floor, caring for nothing but the contact between their bodies. That night, Arthur's healing was completed not by abstinence, but by surrender. In the shadows of the library, amidst sighs and whispered promises, the drunken Marquess died for good, and in his place was born a man who finally understood that Blackwood Manor, or anywhere they call home, did not destroy what was fragile, but revealed what was truly strong. They became one, united by a desire that burned brighter than any mistake of the past. As seasons change, so did the very soul of Blackwood Manor. The manor, once a tomb of gray stone and bitter memories, was now filled with the golden light of 1,000 candles and the scent of fresh pine and lilies. But the most profound change was not in the curtains or the polished floors. It was in a man who stood at the head of the table. Arthur had not only reclaimed his title, he had reclaimed his humanity. The shadow of the drunken Marquess had been buried forever under the weight of a love that was as fierce as it was healing. I watched them one evening from the gallery as they walked through the restored gardens. The mist still clung to the cliffs, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a veil, protecting the sanctuary they had built together. Arthur's stride was confident, his eyes clear and burning with a steady, quiet heat every time they landed on Clara. She had done more than pay a debt. She had resurrected a king, and in return, he gave her a devotion that was absolute. The sexual tension that had once been a source of friction had matured into a deep, simmering passion. It was in the way his hand lingered on the small of her back as they greeted guests, or the way her breath hitched when he whispered a private joke in her ear. They were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. They were a single force, inseparable and electric. The mad Marquess had become the most envied man in the country, not for his wealth, but for the way his wife looked at him, with a pride that outshone any jewel. A year later, the halls of Blackwood rang with a sound that had been absent for decades, the cry of a newborn child, a son, an heir who would never know the smell of stale whiskey or the coldness of a father's neglect. When Arthur held his son for the first time, I saw a single tear track through the rugged lines of his face, a final release of the man he used to be. He looked at Clara, who was resting against the pillows, her hair a halo of wild silk, and in that gaze there was a promise of a lifetime protection and unyielding desire. "You were given to me to pay a debt," he whispered to her that night, as the firelight flickered in their private chambers. "But I am the one who will spend the rest of my days trying to repay you for the life you gave back to me." Clara smiled, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of victory and a love that had survived the dark. The story of the drunken Marquess and the girl who was sold ended not in tragedy, but in a breathtaking rebirth. None had foreseen what would follow that cold transaction, a passion so wild and a bond so deep that it turned a prison into a kingdom and a debt into a legacy of love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.